The following video contains discussions of adult content that some viewers may find too edgy, so if you have children in the room, make them leave, blah blah blah, you've been warned.
Ah, yes, Garfield. So stale and repetitive, telling the same old I hate Mondays jokes and the same old lasagna jokes for the past 40 years. Garfield is often criticized for how bland and offensive it is, such as Slate saying that Garfield was created solely to make money off merchandise, or this one Twitter user saying that Vice President Pence likes the comic specifically for how inoffensive it is. Of course, these writers ignore things such as the time Jim Davis had Garfield kill a granny in the 9 Lives book, or the time Jim Davis scrapped an entire Garfield movie because it was considered too dark by everyone. Yeah, believe it or not, there actually was a time when Jim Davis would kind of push the limits of what he could get away with. Now, while Garfield has never done any comics as controversial as, say, maybe like Doonesbury, doing a comic where Beatty goes to Iraq, loses a leg, and then screams, "Son of a bitch!" It's still kind of shocking to go back to older Garfield comics and see jokes that Jim Davis would probably never write today. So come join me today as I look at the most inappropriate Garfield comics.
And just so you all know, I'm only covering the comic strip in this video. I'm not covering inappropriate jokes from spin-off books or TV shows or the movies or social media gaffes.
Or inappropriate Garfield products like, this Garfield massager that's getting a resurgence in attention. Yeah, sorry, the batteries in this thing are dead, so I can't demonstrate, the lewd uses for this product, on camera. Oh well, I can just rub it on my body. Oh, that feels good. Yeah, so let's get started. I'm going to go over these comics in chronological order. First, of course, is the famous pipe comic that Lasagna Cat parodied. I wanted to cover this comic because in more recent years, companies like Disney are starting to crack down on smoking in their older movies. And similarly, John used to smoke a pipe in some old Garfield comics, but he doesn't do that anymore. So, Jim Davis has been cracking down on not depicting any drug use in his comics.
Maybe that's why Garfield had to do Cartoon All-Stars to the rescue. Jim Davis didn't want Garfield to be a feline Joe Camel, and this was his way of doing penance for all the times Garfield smoked.
Next, we have a comic of Odie getting scolded by his original owner, Lyman, for peeing on the floor, and not only is Odie getting smacked with a newspaper, the way Lyman is holding Odie's neck, it could be interpreted as strangulation. So, yeah, this comic would probably be considered animal abuse by today's standards. Maybe that's why Lyman doesn't appear in Garfield anymore. Here's a shocking one. Garfield tries to kill himself because he doesn't want to get declawed. I know that old cartoons used to do a lot of suicide jokes, like, Looney Tunes cartoons had characters shooting themselves. Tom and Jerry had one episode that ends with them sitting on train tracks. And other comic strips like Pogo Possum surprisingly did a lot of suicide jokes. Garfield comic like this totally would not fly today. Yeah, due to more awareness about suicide and mental health and everything. Yeah, and surprisingly, this is not the only suicide joke in Garfield. I cannot believe Jim Davis, did this joke repeatedly. Oh boy, John looking at what's obviously a Playboy magazine in the mail. Now, I'm not judging John here. I know he had to get his jollies off somehow before he became a couple with Liz. And admittedly, I like to look at For Affinity with the Safe for Work filter off sometimes. But, yeah, Jim Davis would probably not do a comic like this today for 2 reasons. One, he's not going to make a Playboy joke like that. And 2, it's probably dated. Like, the women that are referenced in this magazine, they're Farrah Fawcett and Elk Summer. Like, they were models in the 70s that Jim Davis probably liked. He's probably not going to date himself and reference old celebrities that no one remembers now, unless, I don't know, you lived at that time or something.
Garfield used the word sex, and he says sex and violence is great. Man, we cannot have Garfield saying stuff like that to our children. Yeah, I'm sure this comic would give parent watchdog groups nightmares. Seriously, Garfield. Wow, you were quite rambunctious in your early years. Here's another comic where Garfield steals John's pipe, albeit not as famous as the first one. Seriously, Garfield, I'm shocked to find you were, addicted to smoking in the 70s. Jeez. Were you trying to teach children to get lung cancer? Anyway, I should note, this is the last time Garfield smokes in his comic strip. John would smoke his pipe in a couple future comics in the 80s, but then by 1986, Jim Davis kind of stopped depictions of smoking. He would sometimes depict pipes, but they'd either be bubble blow toys or they're not smoked at all. It makes me wonder if maybe Jim Davis himself was a smoker, but then when he decided to quit, he made his characters quit too. Yeah, good job, Garfield. Glad you kicked the habit. Here's a comic that is surprisingly violent. Even though there's no blood or anything, it's still just kind of shocking to see in Garfield. I'm sure Jim Davis would not draw something like this today. You can see that Lyman kicks Odie, so there's yet another example of animal abuse. And in the last panel, John strangles Lyman, which might lend some credibility to the theory that maybe John killed Lyman. After all, Jim Davis often says, don't look in John's basement. Even more strangulation. I think I figured out Jim Davis's secret kink. This one's interesting because it was actually adapted into the opening of Here Comes Garfield, but Jim Davis notes in the 25th anniversary Garfield book that the studio had him change Garfield strangling John to Garfield just shaking his cheeks. Someone finally reined Davis in. Jeez. Garfield says he loves Monday mornings. This is probably the least offensive comic on this list, but I'm still counting it because it's completely inappropriate that Garfield acts out of character and says he loves Mondays. What was wrong, Garfield? Did you have an off day or something? This comic is so bizarre that Platypus Comics listed it on their list of the world's most baffling Garfield comics, and I have to agree with that. This is just really weird. Remember how a couple years ago there was a rumor that Garfield is gender neutral? Well, ironically, in 1979, Jim Davis did a comic with a sex change joke. And how I found this comic, it's kind of weird. Like, if you search sex in the Garfield comic strip search, this comic comes up even though the word sex is not used in any of the dialogue. It's Pride Month right now, and with trans and non-binary people, coming out and being more visible these days, yeah, I don't think a comic like this would go over very well. I mean, Jim Davis's intention was probably to just say, oh, look, Garfield's really scared of vets. But, yeah. He'd probably be a bit more careful these days. Here's yet another comic about strangulation. This time Garfield chokes Irma, a waitress at a diner that he and John like to eat at. So not only does this comic again depict strangulation, it's depicting violence against women. Like, geez, Garfield, you'd be canceled today over this stuff. Thankfully, though, Garfield has changed his ways. I guess he saw the Gillette ad or something, and he tweeted support for International Women's Day on Twitter earlier this year. Thank you, Garfield, for being an ally. It feels really weird to go back to these old John and Liz comics, years before they became an official couple. And here we see that Jim Davis has gone from making jokes about women getting strangled to making jokes about men getting their balls chopped off. Like, wow, Garfield, that's pretty impressive. Jim Davis has now managed to offend both feminists and MRAs. Like, holy moly. 1970s Jim Davis took no prisoners. Wow. Brandy Bobcat and Quentin Reviews have both pointed out how disturbing this Garfield comic is. John forcibly kisses Liz when Liz is clearly saying she does not consent. Yeah, which is pretty disturbing now that John and Liz are now an official couple. Yeah, so Liz is part of the Me Too movement, I guess, now. Shame on you, Jim Davis, for drawing a comic like this. Here's yet another Garfield comic that makes a suicide joke. Like, seriously, Garfield, you were really edgy. I mean, I know you sometimes make dark jokes, like you say that Old Yeller is your favorite movie, but just stuff like this goes way too far. And guess what? This isn't the last suicide comic. There's gonna be a couple more after this one. Here's yet another strangulation joke. I guess you could say this comic is Liz getting some revenge on John after John basically forcibly kissed her. But still, I know there's probably going to be a pissed-off MRA somewhere that takes this comic out of context, ignoring all the jokes Jim Davis makes about women, and try to use this comic to say, oh, Jim Davis is a misandrist or something. But still, I don't think Jim Davis would do strangulation jokes today. Here's an interesting Garfield comic that Jim Davis talks about a bit in the 20th anniversary Garfield book. Davis says he wanted to test his editor once, so he submitted a comic that references gambling, sex, violence, and broke a copyright law, I guess mentioning Barbies, where he infringed on copyright. And he passed this off to his editor, and he was surprised when his editor approved the comic. I don't know why Jim Davis says he was surprised, because, the previous comics you just saw, Davis submitted comics that reference, suicide, animal abuse, violence against both men and women. Like, it's pretty clear that his editor just didn't give a shit. This is the second and so far last instance of the word sex in a Garfield comic, using the word sexy this time. And even though John is accidentally calling his mother's voice sexy, I'm sure there's probably some parent groups out there that might object to this comic and say, oh, incest jokes, those are off limits or something. I don't know. Jim Davis says in the 20th anniversary Garfield book that some newspapers took offense at this comic and changed the line sheep jokes to dirt jokes. Now, I didn't get what was so offensive about this comic until I looked up what sheep jokes actually are. Basically jokes about farmers who enjoy the company of their animals a bit too much. This is kind of a shocking comic to see from Jim Davis, because he said in 2 interviews he was inspired to create U.S. Acres because his son once read the word transvestite in a newspaper comic, and he wanted to make a comic that was more kid-friendly. This is just really shocking. On one hand, Jim Davis says, oh, I want to be family-friendly, but then, on the other hand, oh, I'm doing comics with vulgar farm humor. Like, just totally weird. The original Suicide Mouse.avi didn't come from Mickey. It originally came from Garfield, believe it or not. This is another really shocking suicide joke that Jim Davis did. This mouse accidentally gets caught in a mousetrap, and when Garfield frees him, when the mouse's nagging family comes to find him, the mouse decides to just go back into the mousetrap. Yeah, this is really, really shocking from Jim. I should mention that, this mouse does not actually die. Garfield eventually frees the mouse. But still, this is just really shocking to see Jim Davis do. Like, jeez, what was wrong with him? Okay, this is the last suicide joke Jim Davis did, and wow, this is a doozy. Not only does it reference suicide, it also makes light of depression, too.
I remember a while back, furry comedian Two Griffin got in trouble for an insensitive YouTube comment he made about depressed people that feel suicidal, and I'm glad to say that after this comic, Jim Davis pretty much stopped the suicide jokes. I guess, I don't know, maybe an editor or someone finally told him to knock it off or something. But even though this is the last suicide joke, Jim Davis would still do other types of inappropriate jokes after this. In 1987, Jim Davis did a storyline where John dates this overweight woman named Bertha, and in the 20th and 35th anniversary Garfield books, Jim Davis says he got a lot of grief from readers over this storyline. So jokes about fat cats, those are okay, but jokes about fat women, those are not okay for newspaper readers. But Jim Davis, I guess because of these complaints, he decided to do a comic years after the original Bertha storyline, where Bertha loses all her weight. Now, I'm not totally familiar with the body positivity movement, so I don't know if they would applaud this or tell Jim Davis, you're overcorrecting yourself or something. I don't know. I guess Davis is damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. Yes, I am talking about the Halloween comics again. Now, if you haven't seen my Myths About Garfield video, here's the lowdown. Jim Davis really wanted to scare people for Halloween in 1989, so he went around pausing, asking his employees what their greatest fear was, and the answer he got the most was being alone. So he did a week of comics of Garfield confronting the fear of being alone. Garfield is not dead or whatever creepypasta you listen to. Those are all false. All it is Garfield confronting the fear of being alone. Now, this is usually considered one of the scariest Garfield comics ever, and I highly doubt that Jim Davis would ever do a storyline like this again. Yeah. And people said that, Garfield's Judgment Day was dark. Jeez. You've all been waiting for this one. Here you go. John drinking dog sperm. Yeah, this comic has become so infamous in recent years that Jim Davis himself had to explain that what John actually drank was a fertility supplement for dogs, not dog sperm. But that hasn't stopped people from cracking jokes about this comic. Garf Gab tweeted that if you try to buy this comic on a coffee mug, the Garfield website won't let you. So to all the haters that say, oh, Jim Davis just does Garfield for the money, if that was true, wouldn't Jim Davis try to capitalize off this comic? Anyway, I don't think any of the other examples I have, exceed this one comic. I could probably just end this list now, but there's just a couple more comics I want to cover, so let's keep going. What could possibly be offensive about this comic? Well, in the 20th anniversary Garfield book, Jim Davis said he got a lot of letters over using the word sucked in a comic strip. Geez, Garfield, such filthy language. Do you kiss your mother with that mouth? Here's another really weird Garfield comic, The Nerd Hall of Fame. Jim Davis says in the 20th anniversary Garfield book that he got a lot of really angry letters over this comic. He doesn't say why exactly, but I'm gonna guess maybe people didn't like the negative stereotypes of nerds, or maybe this comic was just too gross or weird. Jim Davis says that he doesn't normally do shock humor, so I guess, and by the 90s he was starting to clean up his act, aside from that one dog sperm comic, so I guess maybe by the 90s, audiences were changing and a comic like this was just considered too gross or weird or something. Here's a Garfield comic from the 90s that's pretty much a thinly veiled dick measuring contest. Even Jim Davis admits in the 20th anniversary Garfield book that it becomes pretty risque when you read it a second time. At least John's not forcibly kissing anyone here. This is the last comic I'm going to cover. Now, some of you might read this and wonder what could possibly be offensive about this comic. It's just Garfield killing spiders. The problem is, this National Stupid Day comic ran on Veterans Day in 2010. As far as I'm aware, this is the only time Jim Davis has apologized for a comic, and I think it kind of shows how social media has changed things. The moment that any controversy or complaints were being made about this online, Jim Davis immediately came out and made a statement saying, it was a complete accident that this comic ran on Veterans Day. It's not my intention to offend anyone. Please accept my apology and everything. So that's my list of the most inappropriate Garfield comics. Now, this is not a comprehensive list. TV Tropes has a Getting Crap Past the Radar page that has even more comics that I didn't talk about. But it's interesting to see how Jim Davis has kind of mellowed out in age. He's even admitted in an interview at a convention once that once Bart Simpson, South Park, and Beavis and Butthead came along, Garfield kind of lost his edge.
Garfield was a bad boy. He hated Mondays. He burped. He was a bad boy. And then along came Bart Simpson. Don't have a cow, man. And he was the bad boy. And then along came Beavis and Butthead. Then along came South Park. Then along came... Pretty soon, Garfield is now mom approved.
Garfield is now mom approved.
Anyway, that's all I have to say. Peter the Cat here. Bye, everybody. And in my next video, I'm going to explore one of the biggest mysteries about Garfield. Whatever happened to Lyman? Oh, yeah. I just changed the batteries in this thing. Feels so good. Get my feet paused. Another one. Oh, yeah. Okay. I don't want you seeing where I'm going to put this next, okay? Sorry, Garfield.